You can remove one of these people, it's not going to change the system in itself. The system has become a self-perpetuating sort of stasis where change becomes impossible. Democracy is largely responsible for that because when you change your leaders every couple of years, no long-term change can be affected because all you're doing is people trying to make it to the next election, manipulate a couple of little things to get public approval. And the fact of the matter is the kind of sacrifices that we have to make as a society are not going to be possible to effect within a democratic system because we're talking about long-term sacrifices with no short-term gain, and no one is going to get reelected by doing that. So what the angels are essentially trying to do is give us a tool to manipulate not just whether we want a new car or we want a new temple or to get spiritual information, but to actually manipulate the political structure that we exist in. And this is tremendously significant, and it's what makes the Enochian system very important to study. And Crowley himself did a great deal to what he was trying to do to affect political change, not just by writing people in industry and in government, although he did do that, but also by doing things like the Paris Working, which happened shortly after he received Liber 418, which was, an effect to kind of restore the worship of the old pagan gods. And I think that you can see, we can argue about this, but slightly less than 100 years later, I think that our society has very drastically changed from what it was when Crowley initially started doing this, particularly in terms of the way that we look at sexuality, and the way we look at relations between people, and the way that what people consider to be pure and righteous. I don't think that, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So Crowley gets initiated into the Golden Dawn in around the turn of the century, about 1896, 1898, I forget the exact date. But this is sort of when his magical career starts, and he does his first experiments. In the Book of Thoth, Crowley actually says that the Golden Dawn ended in 1900, as it was, which is not exactly accurate, but as far as he was concerned, Mather's leadership was disputed at that point, and the order sort of schismed. And then sort of what you had was sort of a French sector of the occult and a British sector of the occult. Existing evidence probably suggests, because you have guys like Girardacus and Eliphas Levi in France, that they were probably the more sophisticated, better educated group, but they were sort of wiped out by the Nazis in World War II, so we have a lot less information about what they did. The reason that most of what we have from the Golden Dawn, and that's sort of the spiritual forefather of modern occultism, really just has to do with the fact that the Nazis never really made it into Britain and weren't able to destroy that as it existed. So whether it's sort of the weak sister of occultism or not, that's what we're stuck with, because the major occult sections before were in France and Germany, and so obviously they were wiped out more or less, except for what we have of the beginnings of the OTO and whatnot. Not totally wiped out, but a great deal of material that could be very useful to us today did not survive. Which is the same when we look at the Enochian timeline. I mean, we're basically taking a jump from the 15th century to the 20th century, or 16th century to the 20th century. There's a couple hundred years there where we don't really know a lot about what happened or what magicians may have been practicing or how they may have been using the Enochian system, simply because there is not a lot of evidence left behind. So 1900, in Mexico, Crowley did the first two aethers. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, this is tremendously significant because if you look at what Crowley says about these two aethers, he makes constant references to the Book of the Law in his footnotes in The Vision and the Voice, but except for the fact that he had these visions before he got the Book of the Law. So it was much later that he started to connect the dots between what he saw then and what he got in Liber Al. And of course, Liber Al comes in 1904. This happened when Crowley had his HGA experience, which sort of represented his culmination of that work of the Outer College of the Golden Dawn, which is the same point at which they start to teach you about Enochian magic and you start to get that material. So there is an intrinsic connection there, not just because he was learning Enochian magic, but because we're told that Enochian magic is to initiate the apocalypse. And this is a book where Crowley's being told that he's the beast of Revelations, which is, significant to the apocalypse. There's several things in the Book of the Law that are direct quotes from Revelations, and the imagery from that book is rife throughout the Book of the Law. So we can look at this as sort of this is definitely part of the trajectory of what the Enochian angels intended when they initially came up with this system. And yes, so as Crowley, of course, didn't cotton to the Book of the Law right away. It took him a little while to start to adapt it or get to use it as a system to begin to promulgate the law. In 1907, he started the AA, and that's around the time that he started receiving the holy books of Thelema, which we use now. But he makes it very clear that he got them before he really understood what they meant, and it wasn't until years of ritual work later that they started to make sense to him, and he started to understand them, and that's sort of when he started writing commentaries about it and stuff like that. A couple years later, 1909, he and Victor Newberg go into the desert, and he gets the vision of the voice, what we know as Liber 418, and again, this starts to elucidate the holy books. It starts to elucidate the Book of the Law, and it starts to give him a more radical method of biblical interpretation, because he's not just talking about the Book of Revelations there. He's looking at creation myths, he's looking at Genesis, he's looking at things like the Tower of Babel and sort of where that all fits in. He does the Abel-Dees working in 1911, which gives way to Book 4, Magic and Theory and Practice, which sort of is his attempt to fulfill what he got in the Book of the Law, where it says he has to teach people about these things, and he has to instruct people in the occult and ceremonial magic, particularly in ceremonial magic, because there is a current of thought in modern Thelema where people think that ceremonial magic isn't important or it doesn't have to be part of the system, and this is just ridiculous on the face of it. The Paris working happens in 1914, and this is, although it doesn't directly use Enochian magic, it's a very clear product of the magical methods that he used in Liber 418, and sort of an evolution of that. And shortly after, Victor Newberg has a nervous breakdown, and he and Crowley split. And then you see that there's not a lot, like that pair was a very important pair to have, and Newberg sort of couldn't handle it and took off, and which, sort of led to a lack of, after the Paris working, it's not that Crowley doesn't have any other big significant magical events, but they don't, between what happened with Liber Al, what happened with Liber 418, what happened with the Paris working, those are sort of the big three of his magical career, and a lot of his work after that is taking the information that he got there and spreading it out and decimating it and using it in his other books that he wrote after that and the articles that he wrote after that. He will constantly be referring to this throughout the rest of his life, and you really don't get a lot of the big stuff until you get the Book of Thoth. That's sort of the next big book, because he had already written the Book of Lies and so on and so forth. This was his final attempt, where he wrote that around the same time he was writing Magic Without Tears, which is kind of his beginner book or whatever, but it doesn't engage these subjects at the same level of depth that the Book of Thoth does. So I like to think of the Book of Thoth as the intended fruition of the original Enochian transmissions. It does what as I said, it does what the angels sort of originally intended to do. But what Crowley describes it as, very bluntly, is he calls it the algebra of initiation. It's not just, and he in his letters to Frieda Harris when he was designing this, he's very adamant about the point that he doesn't want this to be used as a device for fortune telling. He doesn't see this, divination literally in the sense of getting knowledge from divine sources. Yes, this is what he wants it for, but it's not to figure out when you're going to have sex next, or are you going to get the new job, or whatever. Like, that's not the purpose at all. Initiation, as Crowley explains himself, I should clarify, the Paris working with his attempt to manifest the Magus grade that he'd received in name while doing the Aethers and Liber 418,